Yeah. Okay, so first of all, we want to give you a shakach to Rav Kotler for putting together this program. I want to give you a shakach to Ari Schiff and Rafi Cohen and Uzi Hill for being the shlichim. Shakach. Superman, I want to give you a shakach to Superman. Superman. Okay, very nice. And a shakach to all those who live with their parents and went out of their way to make their parents part of their learning experiences, which is very nice. And welcome to all the parents and relatives who are there. Okay, so let's learn about Tu B'Shvat. The source for Tu B'Shvat is all the way back in the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, the first source here. First two Mishnayot there talk about two things. One is the concept of Roshei Shanim, the beginnings of years. The other is, Mishnah Bet, the 4 times when the world is judged. And in both of these categories, we have a special status for trees. Of the Roshei Shanim, there's a machlok between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, whether it's the beginning of Shvat or Tu B'Shvat, but everyone agrees Chodesh Shvat has a special status as Rosh Hashanah La'ilan. And as far as when the fruits are judged, it's a little bit later in the year. Right? The year begins with Shvat, but the judgment that determines how much fruit there will be is on Atzeret, on Shavuot, Al Perot HaIlan. You look at this Mishnah, the Mishnah seems to be purely technical, just knowing the beginning of the year, which has implications for knowing what year of Masrot the fruit are from, knowing whether it's Shemitah fruit or not, seems to be pretty technocratic and irrelevant to our lives and experiences. But that's why it's interesting, if you take a look at number 2 on page 1, that we find already early Rishonim who saw all this as relevant and important for our lives as human beings. Rabbeinu Gershom, the famous Rabbeinu Gershom. Everybody knows the takanot that he made. What takanot did he make? Anyone knows? Oh, it's interesting that Jake said that. You're not allowed to read people's mail. That's not the one, it's true, but that's not the one people generally think of. What? Now that I marry more polygamy, right? Everyone knows the famous story in the yeshiva about, not this yeshiva in Europe, about those two things coming together. David knows the story. So supposedly, the mashgiach in one of the yeshivas was reading the mail of the Talmidim, which is a well-known, Masorah in Europe yeshivas. Rav Tuvia does not read your mail, but or email, but I'm saying the yeshivas in Europe. And so a boy gets a letter from a girl, which is normal. He's going out, he's that age, okay, and she's writing how much she loves him and wants to marry him. Also good. Yeah, very nice. And then all of a sudden the woman writes, but so does Leah. We both love you so much when neither of us is willing to give up on you. And therefore we decided that we're going to both marry you. And the mashgiach is like, right? And she goes through this whole thing, Rachel describing how they're going to both be married. They're splitting days. They'll both work to be mafarnes. The mashgiach is freaking out. And he goes, you'll say this, all the different claims that the guy could supposedly come up with to say no. Finally, she goes, and maybe you'll say that there's a Chaim ben Gershon on marrying 2 women. Goes, yeah, but there's a Chaim ben Gershon on reading other people's mail. Nobody listens to that either. So he made both of the dinim, Rabbeinu Gershom. So there's a tshuva of the Marami Rottenberg, the famous German Rishon, where he quotes Rabbeinu Gershom. You can see at the end of the tshuva he quotes him. And the question was, if the tzibur wants to make a series of Taniot, Bahab, Monday, Thursday, Monday, and one of them is going to fall on Tu B'Shvat. Is it mutter to fast a series of Taniot, one of which will fall on Tu B'Shvat? So the question's asked, and the Rambam quotes Rabbeinu Gershom, who says that the series of Taniot have to be pushed off to another week. Because you're not allowed to fast on Rosh Hashanah, which is in itself a machloket, but he assumes you're not allowed to fast on Rosh Hashanah. Utnan, 4th line, that there are 4 Rosh Hashanim. The Kevan, the Katanilu, Bahadi Hadadi, Dumyu the Hadadinu. Since they're written together in the same Mishnah, since Tu B'Shvat, Rosh Hashanah Lilanot, is written together with what we call Rosh Hashanah, and you can't fast on Rosh Hashanah, therefore you can't fast on Tu B'Shvat either. They're written next to each other, they're similar to each other, one is like the other, you can't fast on Tu B'Shvat. Later on in the Tshuva, he quotes other halachos, we learn one from the other. This halacha is brought in the Shulchan Aruch, right? Second source in number 2, that you're not allowed to make a series of Taniot that will fall out on Tu B'Shvat. Even though the Ramah is makel in the 3rd line of the Shulchan Aruch here, that if you started fasting the series and you get up to the one that's Tu B'Shvat, you continue, Ein Mafsikin, the Bach disagrees. The Bach says that even if you started fasting the series, if you get up to Tu B'Shvat, you have to stop. We see on page 2 other halachic implications of this. For example, there's a question about a chatan who's getting married on a Yom Tov. Let's say you can't get married on a regular Yom Tov. Let's say Chanukah or Chodesh Nisan, when we don't say Tachnun. Does the chatan fast on the day of his chuppah? So the Ramah discusses it by Hanukkah. The Magen Avraham references Tu B'Shvat, and he says that a person getting married on Tu B'Shvat does not fast. The Magen Avraham explains why. Kevan shemuzkar b'Gemara. The Tu B'Shvat einu mitana, kevan shemuzkar b'Gemara. Similarly, the explanation for what the Magen Avraham means is like we saw in Rabbeinu Gershom. It's mentioned in the Gemara, specifically the Mishnah, together with Rosh Hashanah, and therefore, just like you don't fast on Rosh Hashanah, even if you're Chatan, right? You wouldn't fast on Tu B'Shvat. A third halacha, third source on page 2. Shulchan Aruch paskins that we don't say Tachlin on Tu B'Shvat or the end of Chazar week. Come on, that was a perfect. It's waiting for you. Okay, in any case, you don't say Tachlin on Tu B'Shvat. Shulchan Aruch, if you look carefully, seems to imply that the mincha before Tu B'Shvat you do. Let's read the Shulchan Aruch. Nagu shelo lipol apneim b'tu b'av v'lo b'tu b'shvat, and then he says v'lo b'rosh chodesh v'lo b'mincha shelefanav. So the mincha shelefanav, you don't say Tachlin which day? It doesn't say lifnehem, it says lefanav, right? It's not only rosh chodesh, but Tu B'Shvat you would say mincha before. But the Mishnah Berurah says our minhag is not to say Tachlin even on the mincha before. All this is surprising. Why should Rosh Hashanah Lilanot have any significance for us? Why should it be a basis for simcha in any way, shape, or form? Okay. Now, there are two other things I want to speak about Tu B'Shvat before we start explaining things. Two customs. The first is a custom quoted by the Magen Avraham on the Shulchan Aruch, number 3. He says that the Ashkenazim have a custom to have a lot of peiros that come from trees. I think it's Sfardim too. No, it's right, Sfardim too. But he's Ashkenazi. He talks about the Ashkenazi custom. Now, here's something very interesting. Most of you know that on Tu B'Shvat we have dried fruits, right? Everybody knows you have to have dried fruits. Why do you think it's dried fruits? Why do you think the custom is to have dried fruits? Why dafka dry? Now, having gone to elementary school and gotten Tu B'Shvat bags, you guys get Tu B'Shvat bags in elementary school? I think the reason you have dried fruits is because they're easier to throw at each other. Did you have this in your school? Fruit wars? Nobody would actually eat the buxer, but what a great weapon. You throw the desks over, you have the fig grenades. The candy you eat, the reason they give you candy is because if there was no candy, we just throw the bag right into the garbage, right? That's not the real reason, assumably, that you should have fruit wars. Why do you think it's dried fruits? I assume the reason why is because 100 years ago, you couldn't get fresh fruit from Eretz Yisrael. It would be spoiled, right? That's why they started eating dried fruits. Why do I make this point today? Because today people are very happy to have dried fruits. To the point where they don't have dried fruits in Israel, we import from Turkey. Which of course is exactly the opposite. Meaning, it's not a din in dried fruits, it's a din in peiros Eretz Yisrael. So the question is, what's the deal with this? A second minhag that's begun in the last 100 years is to plant trees on Tu B'Shvat. You guys ever hear of this thing? Planting trees on Tu B'Shvat? Now, of course, you can't do it this year because it's Shemitah. And people, growing up in Chutz La'aretz in the last 100 years, know very well, not in the last 20, 30 years, but before that, people would collect money for trees in Israel. JNF, you would, contribute money and buy a leaf or a branch or a tree. This is very serious stuff. And the question is how does this connect to Tu B'Shvat? It's cute, but how does it connect? And as we'll see, I think it connects very, very strongly. So obviously, in order to explain all this, we have to go back to the very roots in the psukim of the relationship between people and trees and why Tu B'Shvat as Rosh Hashanah Lilanot should have any significance for us as human beings. So Ot Bet, Dvarim Perek Chaf, you're laying siege to a city. There's an isser to cut down a fruit tree to use as a battering ram. Right? Perek Chaf, Pasuk Yutet. But what's interesting is how it's formulated. Because you're supposed to eat from the tree and not cut it down. Ki ha'adam eitz hasadeh. Because man is like the tree of the field. Okay, we don't know what it means yet, but we see that there's a relationship being set up here. What does all this mean? So I think we can get an explanation for this by looking at the very next parak in Sefer Dvarim, and then understanding a little bit better what all of it means. Dvarim Perek Chaf Aleph, it talks about where we find a corpse, a human being that has died and we don't know how he died and who killed him. Everyone knows the law. We measure the closest city and what's the halacha called? Egel Arufa. Very strange ceremony where we take a calf that's never worked into an area that's never been worked in, and we cut its head off. The Gemara in Sota explains, in the name of Hashem, which is assumably a pretty good source, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that we take something that's never made fruit and we destroy it, right? We ensure that it will never make fruit in a place that fruit has never been derived from, to be mechaper for a person who was not given the opportunity to create his fruit. And the Gemara says, what fruit are we referring to the person could have made? So if you mean children, what about if the person was an old man or sterile, unable to make children? So the Gemara says, even a person like that could have done mitzvah. All people have potential. Every moment of their lives, they have the potential to do something worthwhile. And wasting that potential is a terrible thing. And it's the same point regarding a tree. If a tree can make fruit, if a tree can't make fruit, so the tree can be used as wood. But if a tree can make fruit, using it as wood is an insult to that potential. And therefore, a fruit tree that can make fruit should not be used as a battering ram, because humans are like trees, and we need to appreciate the potential that they have, and we have, and we all have, and use them to their maximum. And I think if we look particularly at the comparison of a human being to a tree, because again, everything has potential. Why dafka a tree? If you look back at the Mishnah on page 1, it talks about how Shvat is Rosh Chodesh Lilanot, but Echad B'Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah to the Shanim, the Shmitim, the Yovlos, and the Netiot. Meaning, when a tree is first planted and it's a sapling, its Rosh Hashanah is not Shvat, it's Tishrei. Shvat is the Rosh Hashanah La'ilanot. What does all this mean? A tree has greater potential than a sapling, because a tree dies every year and comes back to life. The tree becomes dormant and yet can once again awaken and reproduce. A human being is like a tree that it has the resiliency to come back. And that is very powerful, even if a person hasn't been showing anything for a very long time. They always have potential to do something. And therefore, the respect for trees is in essence a parallel to the respect we should have for each other, for ourselves. Along similar lines, the Bnei Sachar, on the bottom of page 2, points out something interesting about between Tu B'Shvat and the day when the world's creation was begun. If you hold that it was Nisan, Nisan was when man was created, so that's the 6th day, 5 days before. It's Chaf Hei Adar, it's 40 days before. And 40 is the number of days where a baby reaches its first major point. 40 days before is the ability to see before something is already significant, its potential, the potential of what it could reach. Tu B'Shvat is the potential for the world's creation, so to speak. And by the way, Tu B'Av is 40 days before Chaf Hei Elul, which would be the parallel there. The ability to see the potential of something even when it's still dormant is an important thing in general in the world, seen through trees, and very relevant to human beings. So that's number one, the potential, the hidden potential of trees and of human beings. I want to move now to point number 2, and that is the significance of planting. We're on page number 3. The Torah in many places speaks about following the ways, and even the higher level of dveikut, some kind of connection with God. And the question is, how do we accomplish this? The Medrash asks on page 3 the obvious question. Can a human being truly follow God? Can a human being, second paragraph, be ola l'shamayim and be misdabek b'shchina? Can a human being connect to God in some way? The last paragraph, the Medrash says, the way we follow, the way we connect with God is by following his ways. And the way chosen here in the Medrash is by planting. God planted in Gan Eden, you too. When you get into the land, you should make sure to plant as well. This theme is emphasized by many midrashim. For example, Vayikra Perek Tetet, it says when you get to Eretz Yisrael, you should plant fruit trees. The Medrash Tanchum elaborates on this and says, Havu zehirim b'netios. Be cautious, make sure to plant trees. It quotes HaKadosh Baruch Hu as saying, learn from me that I planted in Gan Eden as well. Maybe the sharpest formulation of this we find in Avot Rabbi Natan, which says that if you have a sapling in your hand and you're about to plant it and you're told that Mashiach has arrived, it says, Bo neteyat netiyah, first plant the sapling, and then go out and welcome the Mashiach. Most of us think that our goal, the whole purpose of our lives, is to bring the Mashiach. This medrash is making a point that the purpose of our lives is to do our work. Our job is to plan, not to welcome the Mashiach. That's the constructive responsibility that we have, and that's what our focus should be on. If you look at all these midrashim, the pasuk they're quoting, and it's underlined here, is from Bereshit Perek Bet, which describes the planting in Gan Eden. Vayita Hashem Elokim Gan Be'eden. I believe if we take a closer look at the context of that pasuk, we'll gain a better appreciation for the significance of planting. Perek Bet pasuk Daled begins Eila Toldot Shamayim Va'aretz B'Aram. This is the development of Shamayim Va'aretz when they're created. It says in pasuk Hey, all of the bushes, everything that was going to grow, has not yet grown. Terem Yitzmach. Why? Because God hasn't made it rain yet. Things haven't grown because God hasn't made it rain. God hasn't made it rain because there's no human being to work it. Even the things God plants, He plants with the understanding, and only once human beings are ready to do the work that they need to do. In fact, if we look at the next psukim, starting in pasuk Chet and Tet, it describes how God does all the planting. Again, as part of the context of man being placed there. Let's look at pasuk Chet. Vayita Hashem Elokim Gan Be'eden Mikadem Vayosem Sham et Ha'adam Asher Yatzar Vayatzmach Hashem Elokim Min Ha'adama Kol Eitz Nechmad. The planting process begun in pasuk Chet, continued in pasuk Tet. In between the end of pasuk Chet, describes the placement of man there. In pasuk Tet Vav, the Torah mentions for a second time the placement of man in Gan Eden. Why is it mentioned the second time? Because here we're talking not just about the world, the plants being there for man, but we're talking about man being there for them. Man has a responsibility to work, to protect, to guard the world that he's placed in. Very famous midrash, which talks about how God takes man around by the hand, tells him, look at this beautiful world I created for you. You're now responsible for it. If you do the wrong things, you'll destroy it, and nobody will be able to fix it for you. And of course, later on the top of page 4, when man in fact does the wrong thing and eats from the tree, the curse that he receives is not a personal curse. It's araha adama ba'avurecha. The land is cursed because of you. Man is responsible. The world is created for man. Man is responsible to maintain it. And when man does the wrong things, he brings the world down with him. This, of course, is one of the models for modern Orthodoxy's understanding of man's place in the world, not just as dealing with himself and learning in mitzvot, but developing the world around him. And all this is true anywhere in the world. It's even truer when we talk about our relationship with Eretz Yisrael. Let's take a look now on page 4. It goes back to the Avot. As we know, Devarim Perek Aleph, when Hashem starts talking to the Jewish people about the land that's going to be theirs, let's look at pasuk Chet. It says, Re'ei natati lefnechem et haaretz, bo rishu et haaretz asher nishba Hashem la'avotechem la'Avraham liYitzchak u'Yaakov. Come inherit the land that God has promised to your ancestors, then specified. The Sifri explains that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov's actions, each one on their own, make the land something that we are worthy to inherit. The Sifri elaborates, gives a mashal of a king who gives his Eved a sadeh. The Eved who truly loves the king does his best to develop that field, to make it what it can be. Says the Sifri, that's what Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov all did in relation to Eretz Yisrael, quotes Psukim, where it talks about their development of the land. In fact, Chazal take it back to the first one of the Avos value system when he arrived in the land. As we know, second source about on page 4, Avram's first thing he hears from Hashem, at least reported by the Torah, is go to the land I'll show you. God didn't tell him where it was. You can imagine Avram wandering around. The Medrash about on page 4 depicts this reality. It says he went to Aram Naharaim, Aram Nachor. He saw people eating, drinking, and partying. His response was, Halavai lo yeheli chelik b'aretz. I hope this is not where God wants me to be. Wonder how we would have responded. When he got to the northern border of Eretz Yisrael, he saw people working the land, and he said, Halavai yeheh chelki b'aretz. Halavai, this is where God wants me to be. So if we feel bad about the fact that the land we've been gifted is a land you need to work to survive in, we have Avram to blame. Maybe this was part of the test, to see if his values were wanting to receive a world in which he had no role, or wanting to play a role, wanting to feel responsible for developing the world that he's part of. This was Avram's priority. And if we continue beyond the Avot, on page 5, we just read in the Shiur yesterday, Tiviemo v'titaemo b'har nachalatcha. The Jewish people, when they are starting to yearn, feel, anticipate their relationship to Eretz Yisrael, part of it is the planting role they're going to play. I mentioned this pasuk before, but let's relate to it a little bit more now. Second source, page 5. When you get to Israel, it says, and you plant fruit trees. The Medrash says, when they were in the desert, everything was provided for them. Third line, when they got into Eretz Yisrael, Amar lehem Moshe, kol echad ve'echad mikem, each and every one of you, yiton makusheh ve'yipok ve'yinsav le'netzivim. Each one of you should get out and start planting. What you see from this formulation is that planting is not just a din that the land needs to be developed. It's a chiyuv gavra, right? Each person has a responsibility to do something, to plant something, to create something. And we see this expressed in Melachim Aleph, when Shlomo finally brings the kingdom to the potential that it has. It says in Pasuk Hey, Perek Hey, Pasuk Hey, Vayeshiv Yehuda v'Yisrael levetach. The Jews lived securely. How is that depicted? Ish tachat gafno v'tachat teinato. Each one under his personal fruit tree. And this is where Rashi gets his formulation of what the Torah means in Dvarim Perek Lamed Gimel when it says Vayishkon Yisrael betach. The Jews will reside in peace. Betach badad, says Rashi, kol yachid v'yachid, as we saw earlier. Ish tachat gafna v'tachat teinasa mefuzarin. This is an expression of Jews living in the land in the ideal form. And this is why, if we look throughout the Gemara, we find many different places where Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is understood to include developing the land. For example, the Gemara Baba Batra Daf Yudal Amud Aleph tells us that Rabbi Yanai planted 400 vineyards, which is an unbelievable number. Hard to imagine he planted all those vineyards. And the Reuven explains he did it because of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and therefore his efforts were seen as what was responsible for the planting of many more vineyards. Another interesting Gemara, which is actually a halacha. The Gemara says, let's say I have a field with zaytim, olive trees, and a flood comes and washes my olive trees into somebody else's field. So if I live in Chutz La'aretz, I have a right to take my olive trees back. But if I live in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yochanan says, because of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, we leave the olive trees in the new field. This is how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. And the Sma explains, we want to make sure there are as many fruit trees in Eretz Yisrael as possible. So if the fruit trees get left in the new field, mistama, you'll plant new fruit trees. And this way there'll be more fruit trees. Of course, the guy has to pay you for your fruit tree, but you don't have a right to bring it back. We see other places where this idea is expressed too, particularly the Chassam Sofer's resolution of a seeming stira between two Gemaras about the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. This Chatam Sofer, by the way, was left out of later printings of the Chatam Sofer that were printed after the Zionist movement gained traction, lest people think the Chatam Sofer was a Zionist. And interestingly, it appears in the first version and in recent versions. The Gemara in Brachot Daf Lamed Hey Amud Bet very famously says that it's important not only to learn Torah, but also to work. How do we know that we should stop learning Torah to work? And of course, we should learn Torah all the other times, right? How do we know? Because it says, Hanig ben minig derech eretz, divrei Rabbi Yishmael. The Gemara in Hakotel quotes Rabbi Yishmael very differently. It says that his nephew Ben Dama asked him, I've learned the whole Torah, can I go study Greek? And Rabbi Yishmael said back to him, go find a time that's not day or night and learn Greek. Because it says, V'giz v'yom v'layla. So the question is, I don't understand. Rabbi Yishmael said in Brachos that to work, you stop learning. So one could, of course, distinguish between work and Greek. There's a lot of chilukim that could be made here. But the Chatam Sofer says there's a difference between work in Eretz Yisrael and work in Chutz La'aretz. And he says the work in Eretz Yisrael, which is what he says, they're referring to, has a fulfillment of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael to produce its holy fruit. And this is the tzivoy of V'asafta Deganecho. Look at the end of the second line. Not wanting to work in Israel is like saying, I don't want to wear tefillin because I'm busy learning Torah. Work in Eretz Yisrael is compared by the Chatam Sofer to wearing tefillin. Wow. So the planting in Eretz Yisrael, tiviemo v'titaemo b'har nachalatcha, our responsibility to plant. The Kuzari flips this idea over in a way that I think complements the first part of what we're talking about. Tiviemo v'titaemo b'har nachalatcha. When we say titoemo, one can understand it to mean planting trees. The other could understand it to mean being planted ourselves, being rooted ourselves. And the Kuzari explains that even though Judaism is a religion that can be lived anywhere and should be observed anywhere and everywhere, there's something special about observing it in Eretz Yisrael. And he says that Jews are a different kind of vineyard, using the mashal, that grow differently in Eretz Yisrael. And their ability to connect to God is only when they are planted in Eretz Yisrael. And so this planting idea has significance for the trees, but also significance for us. I'll mention here, I don't know if it's mutter for me to mention something that's not on the Makara sheet. Is it mutter? Okay, so I'm going to write it on my Makara sheet, so then it'll be mutter. Okay. It's a shame we don't have like a link that when I write, immediately, right? Okay. Rav Nachman Rebeshev has a famous piece, which is really interesting idea, really thought-provoking. Says the Maraglim, what did they say bad about Eretz Yisrael? Anyone remembers? They said it was an Eretz Ochelet Yoshbeha, a land that devours its inhabitants. Now, literally, people were dying. Says Rav Nachman, if the Torah quotes that, it must be that there's some truth to it. What does it mean? So he said, there's two ways of living somewhere. One is you live on the ground, but you have no relationship with it. So the other is where the ground, where you become part of it, where you connect to it, where it swallows you up, where it turns you into part of itself. And he says that is true about Eretz Yisrael. That people who live there, maybe it depends how you live there, you can connect to it in a way that you feel part of it, that you feel that you have been digested by it. And of course, two directions that it plays, your connection with it and its connection with you. And I think that's all included in the Tiviemo, the Tita Emo. Okay. Now we can understand very well, continuing on page 7, why the Galut of the Jewish people brought not only the Jewish people out of the land, but dysfunctionality to the land. It says, as part of the Tochacha, Hashimoti Aniyat Aretz, I'm going to make the land desolate. The Sifra says, this is a Midah Tova. This is a Midah Tova, that nobody else was able to settle the land when the Jews were removed. And of course, we have the testimony of Mark Twain in the end of the 19th century, right before Zionists began developing the land. He talks about the desolation being something that not even imagination can grace with the pomp of life and action. Jerusalem is mournful, dreary, and lifeless. I would not desire to live there. The Ramban writes, along the lines of the Sifra, that this is a Besura Tova, a good piece of news for us, that the land does not welcome, receive, and allow our enemies to settle there. The Gamzu Raya Gdola v'Haftacha lanu. This is a great proof and promise for us as a people, the fact that the land didn't take any other inhabitants on it. And of course, we know from our own times the significance of that in the reversal, as we see on page 8. We take a look at the top of page 8. One of the major features that the Nevi'im talk about, the association with the Geula, is the reflowering of the land. Zechariah says that in the end of days, Ki zera zra hashalom hagefen titein pirya va'aretz titein et ivula. The sign of Jewish return will be when the land begins producing again. Micha talks about the end of days. May remind us of what we saw in Sefer Malachim earlier, Pasuk Daled. V'yashvu ish tachat gafno v'tachat teinato. Remember, we saw that in the time of Shlomo. V'ein macharid, the betach that Rashi described, putting together these two sources. Yeshayahu talks about how you'll build and settle and plant, not for someone else to enjoy, but for you to enjoy. Interesting reference in Pasuk Chavbet about, again, the relationship between people and a tree. Here, not individuals, but the Jewish people. The Jewish people, their days are like the days of a tree. Why would they be like the days of a tree? Because just like a tree can be dormant and then return, so the Jewish people have this return as well. But maybe the most famous, most important source is Yechezkel Perek Lamed Vav. When it talks about the Geula being expressed, and again, the reproduction of the trees, the land that was thought to be forever desolate will once again produce, Pasuk Lamed Hey, after the break here, This land that was desolate now becomes like Gan Eden. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Tzadichet, Rabbi Abba, the different Amoraim are trying to bring different signs of the eventual Geula, and Rabbi Abba says, there's no greater expression of the end of days than the pasuk in Yeshayahu, which talks about the land flowering. When Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook was asked, how do we know Chalta the Geula? He pointed particularly to the flowering of the land, the fact that the land was producing again as a sign, because the fact that Jews return, you can say, okay, Jews have decided to return, but the land that miraculously didn't produce for 2,000 years, that now is producing, this is very significant. And that's why we see the flowering of the land as so significant. And I think that this is the explanation for in Ta'anit Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, which connects between two things that don't seem to have anything to do with each other. Rabbi Yochanan says, I was always wondering what Pshat was. Oh, he's actually talking about one of the Tanoim, not himself. But in any case, one of the Tanoim was wondering, what does the pasuk mean when it says, Shira Ma'alot, B'shuv Hashem et Shivat Zion hayinu kecholmim? How is the Geula like a chalom? So it says one day, he's walking on the road and he saw a guy planting a carob tree. And he said to him, why are you planting the carob tree? You're not going to be able to enjoy it. It takes 70 years for it to grow. So he said, just like my ancestors planted a carob tree, so too, and for me, I'm planting a carob tree for future generations. Fine. So it said that he went to sleep and ended up falling asleep for 70 years. When he got up, he saw a person collecting fruit from that tree. He said to him, oh, are you the guy who planted it? He said, no, I'm his grandson. And he said, that's Pshat, Shira Amalos V'shuv Hashem et Shivat Zion hayinu kecholmim. What's the connection between the concept of him having slept for 70 years and the fruit carob tree, which seems to be two different things? I think the point is that Jews plant trees in Israel even if they know they'll never be able to enjoy it themselves, because they recognize and believe that eternally the land of Israel is going to be the land of the Jews. So even if you're planting in the year 69, to the Common Era, you plant because you know that eventually it's coming back around to the Jewish people. When you're in a land that's not your own, you don't plant because ultimately it's not going to be your own. And that's the concept of the Chalom, of the Geula, being connected to our understanding of the land being ours in perpetuity. Rav Kook writes in his Sefer Maged Yerachim, where he talks about one line about each month. Let's take a look, section bottom, page 8. Cheshek nitiyata ilanot. Note the word cheshek, right? The desire in a more earthy way to plant trees. Novea mechefet, a higher level of desire. Hatavat hadorot habayim hamavalei pitakfo be'etz hacharuv. The desire to plant trees on a higher level can express itself in the passion to do good for future generations, especially when we see that our future generations will be here. And this physicality is something Rav Kook spoke about in a very famous piece, Orota Tchia, on the bottom of page 8, where he talks about how Jews in Gulut had focused very much only on the spiritual side of Jewish existence. He says we've forgotten the physical side of building, of developing, especially when we're in a land that's not our own. And part of the return to Eretz Yisrael needs to be the reconnection with that. And of course, all this can explain to us the significance of planting trees in Eretz Yisrael in association with Tu B'Shvat. But I want to conclude now on page 9 by speaking about the custom of eating Perot Eretz Yisrael, both in Jewish history and today. If we take a look at Al Michya, we know that we ask Hashem to have mercy and rebuild Yerushalayim and the Beit Mikdash, etc. And we say, "V'aleinu letocha v'samchenu b'vinyana v'nochal mipirya v'nizba mituva." That seems very strange when we're talking about the rebuilding of Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim and the Beit HaMikdash, and we hope that we'll return to Eretz Yisrael. Is what we hope to return for eating fruit and being satiated by the goodness of the land? The Smag and the Torah both ask. They say this formulation of Al Michya doesn't seem right to us. We don't desire to be back in Eretz Yisrael for the fruit of the land. Don't we desire to be back for the spirit? So there is actually a source for this in the Nevi'im. If we look in Yirmiyahu Perek Bet, it says, "Ve'vi etchem al Eretz HaKarmel, le'achol pirya v'tuva." In Nehemiah goes even further. It says, meaning here it's described that the reason the land was giving to them was to be able to eat of its fruit and benefit from its goodness. So what's pshat? So I believe the explanation connects back to understanding the very direction we're supposed to be taking in our existence in this world, and through that in Eretz Yisrael. If you look at Bereshit Perek Bet, when God gives his first commandment to man, the first part of the commandment is not don't eat from the Eitz Hadas. The first part of the commandment is eat from all the trees. That's part of the commandment. The second part of the commandment is the snake in Perek Gimel limits God to a prohibitor. If we look at Perek Gimel Pasuk Aleph, the snake says to the woman, God said you can't eat from any of the trees. Now the woman corrects him in Pasuk Bet. No, we are allowed to eat from the trees. But she leaves out the most important point. The machloket between the snake and woman is whether God asks everything or some things. But both of them agree that God's role is only as prohibitor. If you look back in Perek Bet Pasuk Tetayim, we saw God's role is telling us to eat. God gives us the fruit, wants us to eat. It's part of the commandment for life. Tzadok HaKohen makes this point, and he says that the mitzvah was initially, before the chet, the mitzvah say was to eat and bring sanctity and kedusha to the food that would be eaten. And this is how the Bach explains the uniqueness of the fruits of Eretz Yisrael. It says, Tema, how can people challenge the formulation of Al Michya? Halo kedushat haaretz hanishpat ba mikdushat haaretz ha'elyona hinishpat. The kedusha of Eretz Yisrael comes from the higher kedusha. Gam beperoteh sheyonkim mikdushat hashchina shochenet b'kerev haaretz. And the fruits also that grow from the ground have in it this holiness, this sanctity. And I think this can explain, top of page 10, the Yerushalmi, which says, name of Rabbi Meir, Kol mi shekavua b'Eretz Yisrael. Anyone who resides kavua b'Eretz Yisrael. Umedaber b'lashon hakodesh. And it speaks Hebrew. V'ochel peroseha b'tahara. And he eats the fruits in a tahar way. V'korei kriyat shema b'vokav v'erev yehem avusar shekein olam habahu. Well, if you live in Chutzah, at least you can say kriyat shema. But this whole idea of the chavaya of Eretz Yisrael, including eating the fruits properly, is part of how one can get to olam haba. This idea is expressed by Rav Kook in Orot Yisrael based on the psukim in Shiur Shirim Perek Bet. You have here, it's mitzvah lit'om b'fem maleh. It's a mitzvah to eat with a full mouth, meaning completely, without hesitation. Mitanug mitikut ziv hakdusha ha'ra'anana shel Eretz Yisrael. From the pleasure of the sweetness of the fresh holiness of Eretz Yisrael. And then he says in the next part, v'tzrichim lahodia l'chol ha'olam kulo. We have to let the whole world know. La'aluvei ha'galuta afila, those stuck in the darkness of Galus. Ki atzinor shel ha'chayim ha'mleim shefa or v'ni'imut kedusha shel eretz chemdato echel yipatach. That the tzinor, right, the pipeline of full life, full of the light and holy sweetness of eretz chemdato, of his beloved land, has reopened. Hanitzanim niru ba'aretz. The pasuk Eit hadamir higiv v'kol hator nishma b'eretzenu. The last part he says, Eretz ni'imah doreshet et baneha. The sweet land is calling for her children, outstretching her arms to it in love. She covers up all their sins, etc. Meaning, Rav Kook understood that the land's return to regeneration is a way of it calling back its children and telling them it's time to return. And I think this is how we need to appreciate the significance, the great privilege of being able to eat fresh Israel fruits. And not fruits of Israel received somewhere else from somebody else, but the fruits we grow and get to enjoy. It's more than just the fruits. The fruits are an expression of the land reproducing and regenerating and calling the Geula to us and calling us back for the full life as it's meant to be lived by the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, there's significance to the relationship between human beings and trees, as we saw. There's significance to our role in planting trees in general and in Eretz Yisrael. And there's significance to the land of Eretz Yisrael receiving the trees and once again flowering and producing, and our ability to eat these fruits as a sign of it. In America, and throughout the world, they would show these videos of the land of Israel producing, growing. And everyone would sit there, wow. And it was a combination of two things. It was a combination of A, shock, that this land that was desolate could produce. And number two, an excitement over what it symbolized about the rebirth of the Jewish people, particularly in a time when that rebirth was very hard to believe in. Now, it could be today we take these things for granted, but Tu B'Shvat is a day when we're supposed to reappreciate the things that maybe we've come to take for granted. Tu B'Shvat, again, is Rosh Hashanah L'Ilanot, but the reason the Rosh Hashanah L'Ilanot has significance for us is because it's very much a testimony about ourselves as well, as individuals and as a people. So hopefully having the Shiur a few days before Tu B'Shvat can make sure that we can appreciate Tu B'Shvat in the fullest, as Rav Kook writes, B'Fem Oleh, and not just as a day when we don't say Tachnun. May we appreciate it. And very nice to share Torah together with us and our parents and relatives. Wish you all a Shavua Tov. I have to push that button.